Hi, class. Um, this is a lecture I'm going to give you to help you put Darfur is Burning in perspective. Of course, that's the book that's going to be the basis for the last test in the class. Um, you all read Things Fall Apart, and Things Fall Apart was a book that dealt with the period right just before colonization and at the very beginning of colonization. Darfur is Burning is a history of Darfur that goes back to the pre-colonial period, and it also is very largely a colonial history. And then finally, the book deals with the post-colonial period and the war that breaks out in Darfur. Now, Darfur is Burning is an important book because it is a good example of issues that many African countries have had to deal with since they've gained their independence. Now, if you look at most countries in Africa today, they are countries that uh, include many people who did not have any sort of relationship with each other before they became one country, or if they did have relationships with each other, they saw each other as different countries or different groups who did not have a common ruler. That's true for most countries in Africa. I mean, there are some exceptions. Uh, if you look at Somalia, the great majority of people in Somalia are Somali, ethnic Somali. Now, I'm talking about countries south of the Sahara. If you look at Rwanda and Burundi, those countries are, are, are not very diverse. You basically have two major ethnic groups, and even though those countries have had issues with each other, I mean, even though there have been problems inside those countries, the ethnic compositions of those countries did not change when they got their independence. I mean, uh, there had always been the division between the Tutsi and the Hutu, and then you also had a smaller minority of people that in the West we commonly call pygmies. Those are very, very small people who traditionally lived in the forest. But almost all the other countries in Africa have a number of different ethnic groups who really were not connected to each other in any significant way prior to the colony being carved out by Europeans. Now, if you all remember reading the section on Scramble of Africa in your Shillington book, then you know that Europeans sat down in Berlin and, basically carved up a map of Africa. They would say, well, our explorer has been to this place or that place. Or, for instance, something like Kilimanjaro ends up on the Kenya side of the border simply because uh, the ruler thought it was a cool mountain to have. And so they ended up with it. And so the borders in Africa tended to be very arbitrary. And this causes problems. A lot of times, in the modern media, people talk about uh, tribal conflict in Africa, which is a term I really don't like. I would much, I haven't made a big fuss about you all using that term, but I much prefer ethnic or national conflict because these were fully developed nationalities before the Europeans came there. The Europeans tended to call them tribes because a tribe is something less than a nation, and the colonizers did not want to acknowledge that these countries, had national identities, or that the people they were controlling were nations. Now, Darfur in particular is interesting because Darfur is a part of what nowadays is the Republic of Sudan. Until 2011, the Republic of Sudan was the northern part of what was then known as the country of Sudan. Sudan, until 2011, was the largest country in Africa in terms of square miles. it was just under 1 million square miles. In other words, a little bit bigger than the United States east of the Mississippi. So we're talking about a pretty big country, and a country that went a long ways from north to south. The northern border of Sudan borders against Egypt to the east, the Red Sea, to the far east, and it borders against Libya to the northwest. The old borders of Sudan prior to 2011 went all the way south to Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Central African Republic. And so it was a huge country. Went a long ways from north to south. More of the Nile River is in Sudan than any other single country in Africa. Now, Sudan also has a very ancient history. In the beginning of the book, you all read chapters that talked about Kush and talked about Nubia. Those areas were in the northern part of Sudan along the Nile River. Now, after the end of the ancient period, the Arabs came into Egypt. They conquered Egypt. Egypt gradually became an Arabic-speaking country and became predominantly Muslim. And the Arabs also began to make contact with the Sudanese. Now, the Sudanese initially defeated the Arabs, but over time, Arab groups, particularly from Yemen, began to migrate into the Sudan and began to intermarry with local people. And so what we see is that in Sudan, especially along the Nile River, most of the people in that part of Sudan came to see themselves as Arabs. Now, the term Arab is kind of like the term American, in that there's not any particular color that makes you American. At least legally, that's what it says. Now, there are some people who would probably tell you otherwise, but that's not what the law says. A person is an Arab because they speak Arabic and they practice Arabic culture. And so you have in Sudan a situation where the people along the Nile River are Arabs. They speak Arabic. Culturally, they're Arabs. Now, a lot of these people, now in terms of appearance, they're a very diverse group of people. Some Sudanese Arabs, look like Middle Easterners. Some people would appear to be mixed race people. I mean, they may be fairly dark skinned, but they have pretty straight hair, or they may have physical features that look pretty Middle Eastern, but they're dark, just mixed people. And then some of the Sudanese Arabs, are black people, but they happen to speak Arabic. I know the Sudan was the part of Africa where I did my dissertation research, and I worked in Sudan, and at the time, I was a much better Arabic speaker than I am now. I mean, I really have not done research in Sudan since that time, and so my Arabic has gotten rusty. But I remember I could get around, after a month or two, my Arabic got decent. I was never a great speaker, but it got decent. And there were times when people thought I was Sudanese, because there are a lot of Sudanese Arabs that are my complexion and have my hair texture. And so one thing I think you should understand is that, the book talks about the conflict between the Sudanese and Sudanese Arabs and blacks. And in the American context, that sounds very racial. And there is a racist aspect to it. But the thing you also have to understand is that race is something that is not an absolute term. Different societies define it differently. And so in the Sudan, when people are referred to as black, it not only refers to their skin color, but it also refers to their cultural orientation. They're probably not people who speak Arabic as a first language. Religiously, they may not be Muslims, although you have a lot of Muslims in Sudan who are not Arabs. But the bottom line is that modern Sudan came into existence after the ancient period. Basically, Sudan really became Arabized, over a period from, say, about 1500 to about 1800. The great majority of people along the Nile River Valley became Arabic speakers and culturally Arab. However, that's only a small part of the country of Sudan. Uh, you all should look at Martin Daly's book, and he has some maps in there that can help you understand things better. Or else, I recommend that you just simply uh, look up Sudan, look up maps of Sudan, and you can find maps of Sudan, and you can see the different areas better. But anyway, as I was saying, the river portion of Sudan became culturally Arab. Now, the southern part of Sudan was very, very different. The people in the southern part of Sudan were Nilotic people, very tall, very dark-skinned people. They were not Arabic speakers. They were not Muslims. At that time, they practiced traditional African religions. These days, a significant proportion of southern Sudanese are Christians. But culturally, they were very, very different. Now, Darfur, the territory that this book focuses on primarily, was a different category. Darfur culturally was closer to, say, northern Sudan or the people in Chad and Niger than it was to the people further east along the riverbank. Now, these people, the people of Darfur, had been Muslims and had been exposed to Islam for 1,000 years. I mean, the oldest Islamic civilization, the longest lasting Islamic civilization in Africa, in the Sahel region, was the Kingdom of Kanem in Bornu, which lasted from about the year 1000 until the latter part of the 19th century. So, there have been very, very long-lasting Islamic countries and kingdoms in the eastern part of the Sahel. And Darfur was no exception. Darfur had been predominantly Muslim for a very long time. And Darfur was completely independent of what came to be known as Sudan. But what happened is that the British began to expand into the area, and they sought to incorporate as much territory as possible. Now, when World War I came along, the ruler of Darfur united with the Ottoman Turks, who were fighting on the opposite side of the British in World War I. And so when the war was over, Darfur became annexed by the British and became part of the colony of Sudan. And so this is a fundamental problem from the very beginning, because the people of Darfur culturally were different from the Sudanese Arabs. They spoke a number of languages besides Arabic. Arabic wasn't their first language. Now, most of these people were familiar with Arabic because there were Arab traders who came from the north, who came from primarily from the direction of Libya. And these people were also Muslims. Arabic is the liturgical language of Islam. I mean, if you read the Quran is written in Arabic. If you pray in Islam, you pray in Arabic, and so therefore, people have a knowledge of Islam, both have a knowledge, of Arabic as a language of business, and also as a language of their faith. But the people of Darfur were not Arabs. They were very clear that they weren't Arabs. And so what we see is that Darfur becomes incorporated into a country where they were a minority, and that was dominated by another ethnic group. Now, what complicated things further is that the British were really interested in developing cotton as a major export crop in Sudan, because Britain had been the very first country to undergo the Industrial Revolution. And by the time you get to the early 20th century, Britain's textile industry was not very efficient anymore. And countries like Italy, the United States, and others were beginning to undermine Britain in the textile market. And so what Britain did was that they looked towards Sudan as an area where they could grow very high quality cotton, what's known as long staple cotton. And this is the really fine cotton that you can really make fine bed sheets, fine shirts out of. And it's a kind of cotton, for instance, that we can't grow in the United States because the United States does not have a long growing season compared, does not have a growing season as long as the tropical countries. I mean, the southern United States, where I grew up, I grew up in South Carolina. Most of my family lived in Alabama. I mean, those are places where, stuff is growing already down there now, just like it's growing here. And it can make it on into the end of October. Long staple cotton, however, takes about 10 months. You would probably need to be planted in March, and it probably wouldn't be taken up until the end of November, early December. And the United States is just simply too cold for that to be practical. So the British needed a place that did not have frost in order to grow long staple cotton. And so what happens is that the British developed what becomes known as the Jazeera Scheme, which is actually where I did my dissertation research. In the land between the Blue and the White Niles, and Jazeera literally means island. So, if you think of it as kind of an island between these two rivers, that was the area where the British did the great majority of their economic development of the country of Sudan. So what this means is that Darfur is this distant territory out in the west. They get very, very little attention from the government that ruled during the colonial period. Now, Sudan has an unusual status because Sudan is not actually a colony. Sudan had been a territory that had been colonized by Egypt. Egypt, in turn, had been part of the Ottoman Empire. And so when the British came into the area, they realized that legally, if they just took Sudan, then that would have been an act of war against the Ottoman Empire. And so therefore, they claimed that they came in to help administer the territory along with Egypt. And so they argued that Egypt and Britain were the co-domini. And so therefore, the government of Sudan became known as the Sudanese condominium. And to get back to Darfur, Darfur was on the outside looking in. They were these people out to the west, in this desert area where you didn't have a river going through. And the British looked at it and said, we can't really develop that economically. And then also because it was a desert area, the borders were not very well defined. And you always had people drifting in from Chad, and you had folks drifting down south from Libya or occasionally from the direction of Algeria. And so what this meant that there was always instability along the western border. Now this becomes a bigger problem once Sudan becomes an independent country, because the Sudanese government is dominated by people in the river area. Khartoum, Omdurman are the biggest cities in the country. And folks way out west in Darfur are kind of on the outside looking in. And so this eventually develops into a situation where by the time you get to the end of the 20th century, you have active rebellion in Darfur. Now, this rebellion in Darfur was aided by the fact that you had rebellion in southern Sudan. Now, rebellion in southern Sudan has much longer roots because, as I said before, the southern Sudanese were people entirely different from the northern Sudanese. They weren't Muslim, and they were very dark-skinned, very tall people. I know there have been a couple of Sudanese basketball players in the NBA, and I know there was a fellow who played for the Bulls, and some of you all who are older may remember Manute Bol. Manute Bol was a Dinka, and from the southern Sudan. And most Dinka are not 7'7" like Manute Bol, but it is very, very common in Sudan to see people, when I was there, to see people 6'4", 6'5", 6'8", 6'9". I mean, real common. I mean, that's just the way people were built. And frankly, a lot of northern Sudanese are very tall too, because uh, they are related to the people in the South, even though they're culturally very different. And although nowadays, they fairer complexion because their ancestors mixed with Arabs who migrated into the area. But still, a lot of them are very tall because their ancestors were Nilotic people too. But anyway, the southern Sudan and northern Sudan have a couple of wars. There was one war that breaks out in 1956 that lasts until about 1970 or so, 71, when they had the Addis Ababa Accords. That period of peace lasts about 10 years, and then in the early 80s, conflict breaks out again between the North and the South, because by that time, Northern politicians see that their best way to unite the country is to encourage an Islamic State. And for the Southern Sudanese, that meant that they would always be on the outside of their country. And so really, it's from the 1990s up into the early 2000s that we see war developing in Darfur. And then also, in addition to the South, the Nuba Mountains, which are an area that is in northern Sudan, but where you have minority population of the Nuba, not the Nubians. Now, the Nubians live in the far north, in southern Egypt and in far northern Sudan. But in the south central part of the country, you have the Nuba Mountains. And the Nuba people are related to the southern people. They tend to be a mixed population religiously. A certain percentage of them are Muslims, and a certain percentage of them are Christians. But once again, because these people were not culturally Arabs, they felt like they were being left out in the new movement of the government towards Islamism. I mean, basically, under Colonel Namiri, towards the end of his rule in the early 1980s, he moves towards Islamism. He is eventually forced out of office. And then by 1989, Colonel Bashir, General Bashir, becomes president, and he maintains power in the country really until last year. And he's finally, 2019, when he's eventually forced out of the country. He stays in power for almost 30 years. And so it's under General Bashir that the country becomes more and more brutal. And eventually we see a civil war breaking out in Darfur. And this war eventually becomes very racialized, where you have Sudanese Arabs attacking the quote-unquote black Muslim population in Darfur. And it becomes a very nasty war with atrocities and genocide. Now, the bottom line is that Southern Sudan becomes an independent country by 2011. Southern Sudan had a lot of international support. For instance, a lot of American support. There were a lot of American evangelicals, for instance, who supported Southern Sudan because they knew it was not a majority Muslim country, and they felt that it was being oppressed by Muslims. And so, under the Bush administration in particular, the administration of President George W. Bush, there was a great deal of diplomatic support for negotiating a settlement that would eventually result in an independent South Sudan. And that eventually happens in the year 2011 once President Obama is the United States president, and Southern Sudan becomes independent. Now, Darfur ends up still being a part of Sudan, part of what now is the Republic of Sudan. And their needs are never completely addressed, but the ferocity of the violence eventually goes down. Now, once again, the other thing I'd like to talk about too, and this is something that you need to think about when you're looking at the book, is that because Darfur is a desert area and because the borders are not well defined, you have influence from Chad and you have influence from Libya. And in particular, Colonel Gaddafi, who ruled Libya until about 10 years ago, also was a source of trouble for the Sudanese government because he would support rebel movements in the region. And although Gaddafi is gone, this is still something that's going on. I mean, just today, the president of Chad, the country that's next to Darfur, its president was killed during a military battle with rebels outside of the Chadian capital city, N'Djamena. And so it's important to understand that although the war in Darfur is not going on, the area is still not stable. And so when you're reading Darfur is Burning, you need to think about how African countries are coming to terms with the borders that were drawn by colonial powers. Now, in the case of Sudan, it eventually just said, look, it's not worth it for us to try to hold on to Southern Sudan. They're too different from us. It's making us enemies in the international community, so let's let them go. Now, Darfur, on the other hand, being a Muslim territory, they were less inclined to let them go. And therefore, they are still part of Sudan. But they just simply, were beaten up pretty badly in a war. Well, anyway, class, that gives you some kind of reference to look at the book if you haven't started reading it already. And I will come back with another video to talk more about specific questions that might be asked about the book.